Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This one is from Liquid, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about highly specific counterplay, so hopefully you already understand why I'm laughing about this. I do these prompts every month for Parley, just in case people pay for the service and are enjoying it, but this month don't have something they want to ask about. I just present a few that you can take or bounce off of or whatever. So I had written this one that says, there's this really common thing in a lot of build systems where a game piece will negate a mechanic entirely. For example, imagine an enchantment of some kind you can equip, which negates all poison status effects. You simply remove that mechanic from the game while this is equipped. Are these bad? Wording it that way, they seem kind of ridiculous, but I've also often had a positive impression of this design. What say we, me I suppose, about this? And Liquid says, bouncing off that third prompt, the concept is common enough that you can list many examples of this occurring in practice. The name I've chosen for this Parley entry is also just the TV Tropes entry for this concept, lifted word for word. And hilariously, the TV Tropes site has the trap card from Yu-Gi-Oh! Anti-Raigeki as its example. Raigeki is a card in Yu-Gi-Oh! That has no cost to play. You draw it off the top of your deck, you play it, and all of your opponent's monsters die. Anti-Raigeki is a trap card that if you have it in play when your opponent plays Raigeki, they don't blow up your whole board and you blow up their whole board, exchanging a card for a card, but you wipe their entire board, which is very good. But it doesn't do literally anything unless they play that specific card. Glorious. The key factor in my eyes, Liquid's eyes, regarding highly specific counterplay is opportunity cost, of course, which is riddled with nuances and variables, both subjective and objective, that there's never a clear answer, which also makes it very interesting. Here's an example of what we mean by highly specific counterplay and opportunity cost being very married together. You might decide while playing hero shooter number 627 that you hate John Megadeth 9000's Death Ray, by equipping a perk that gives you 30% extra resistance to death rays. But you give up something that would make other characters easy to deal with instead. You lost some other perk because you equipped the 30% death ray resistance perk. But maybe you're fine with that, either because the other enemies are comparatively weaker, or the rest of your build can kill them just fine, or your teammates can pick up the slack, or you have some shortcut that bypasses fighting them entirely. Or maybe you just don't have skill issues and can deal with them despite giving up the other build piece. Maybe you did it because John Megadeth is so centralizing that a build piece to counter him feels necessary. There's a large number of variables that make up opportunity cost, such that you won't ever get a clear-cut answer as to whether it's good or bad. Well, you might feel like you do, but it will be very hard to argue that it is for sure all the time good or bad, right? Granted, we're also assuming that developers know what balance is, which isn't always the case. If they decide to give John Megadeth a perk that cancels out the perk you equipped by transforming his Death Ray into a Hyper Death Ray that delivers Hyper Death, which is much worser than just Garden Variety Plain Death, then you're just going to get a cyclical mess in the long run to the point that you wonder if dealing with everyone else is just more worth it than just dealing with one Hyper Death Ray. In the right kind of build system, some build pieces like that are fine and interesting to toy around with. Interesting. So there's a couple things that were already happening in this Parley, but you've introduced a new, I think, pretty fun hypothesis, which is that the bad thing is actually countering the counterplay that is not good. And I would definitely agree with this. There's a lot of toxic cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically that are a problem because they are highly specific counterplay to counterplay cards. They're a highly specific counterplay, but only to something that is already counterplay. This is very bad, in my opinion, because it usually means that whoever sacrifices more deck space and whoever draws more of that card, they just get into an arms race of shooting off against each other, and when the dust clears, whoever had the last laugh basically just wins, while both players have their hands very depleted, usually meaning that whatever happens next is very hard to stop. This happens a lot in Yu-Gi-Oh! If you've played high-level Yu-Gi-Oh! Before, and, you know, it's all right, I'm here, we're going to be safe, we're safe now. You will know that a lot of the time people will play these cards where if you have them in your hand and your opponent activates an ability, you can discard the card or activate it to negate that ability. A hand trap, if you will. For no external prep or anything, you just have this card in your deck. Some good amount of the time, you're going to draw it and your opponent will do something. You've had no time to set up whatsoever, but you will be able to stop that thing. The problem, in my opinion, begins where there are too many counters to the counter. Too many cards that stop the hand trap but don't really do anything else. Or do, they do other things, but I'm talking about Called by the Grave, okay? People who've played Yu-Gi-Oh, you know what I'm talking about. It does other things, but it targets a card in your graveyard and says that ability doesn't count. You can use this to stop the hand trap cards. And this is a problem because it means that a lot of the game is just built up of you having all this space to sort of resolve out a kind of complicated coin flip to see who's going to be in a better starting position. And on its own, that doesn't sound that bad. You draw in these games, you draw for turn. So what's so bad about having a bunch of resources in your hand that you aren't sure will be really good or not? Well, I think that the problem is that the effect of the counterplay to the counterplay is that once the dust clears, any further effects are now more dramatic. That is, let's say John Megadeath puts on his perk that turns his death ray into a hyper death ray. And you put on a perk that if you have the perk that stops death rays and your opponent has the perk that makes it a hyper death ray, then now you stop hyper death rays as well. What's happening is you're both sacrificing enough build space only to stop the highly specific counterplay that now if anybody does anything else, that thing is now way too strong because you both nerfed the hell out of your perk builds specifically to counter this one mechanic. That mechanic then feels centralizing and cheap in a way that it wouldn't if only there wasn't counterplay to the counterplay, as long as you just couldn't do that. Maybe a different way to put it is, it's almost inherently going to be unfun for the player to feel like they ought to make their build terrible most of the time, but good against these specific builds. So therefore, why not just not make it possible to do that type of centralizing? Why not make counterplay to the counterplay? Or here's a crazy idea, just don't make the counterplay and balance the death ray. Balance the death ray out. A lot of players who are on these sort of just buff things, don't nerf things, buffs are better than nerfs thread, don't seem to have resolved that out to the point where you can see this thing happening. It's not really that good to be in that situation. I do think that one layer of counterplay can be positive. And I guess what we're going to talk about this parlay is, so what is good about these? What is a way to fit them into a metagame that we can use as a heuristic or a thought tool to make them more reliably good? Where if you do it this way or that way, it's pretty clearly bad most of the time. So which ways are vaguely viable as far as we can figure out? And therefore, what is a good rule of thumb? And then what is the logic that you might use to figure out what to do in these situations? Okay, this sounds somewhat challenging. Very nice. It's fine, but like the danger with these prompts that I put up is that they'll be too easy for me to answer. Like after all, they were in my notes, so I know what I was going to say. You have successfully added really interesting nuance. So that's really cool. Good prompt. Let's do this. Going back to basics a little bit, our thesis that we're building up to is to tackle this question of where it is useful to add this highly specific counterplay. So let's just look at it a little bit. I said they can seem a little ridiculous, but I've also had a positive impression of this design. Let's just analyze quickly. You hate poison swamps, and old Miyazaki keeps putting them all over Dark Souls, and you just want to have a thing that negates poison swamps. But FromSoft was born and raised for only one task, which is to put poison swamps into your Souls-like game. So you equip all the stuff that counters poison swamps, and let's just simplify it and say, like in my example, you equip an enchantment or whatever that negates poison swamps. When you're walking on poison or there's poison attacks, that just turns that off. We can now imagine a few situations that might be true. Either one, the game has a big enough build system. There's enough different places in your loadout where you can equip enchantments. You could equip like 10 enchantments, such that paying one enchantment to just delete this mechanic has very little in-context cost. You're not losing much by not having that slot. And there are sufficiently few other mechanics that you're just going to negate with highly specific counterplay, such that you really are only using like 1 or 2 slots on a utility thing out of like 10, like a large amount, a decently large amount. In this situation, the existence of this perk largely deletes that game mechanic. You could argue that it still has some benefits. You're allowed to choose to take it off and play around the poison swamp, but When you do that, you have to respec if there's respecing in this game, if you can't just do it instantly or save a loadout. You have to do something. Probably at minimum, you have to click a swap loadout button, even if there is free respecing all the time, which there often isn't. At minimum, you have to click that thing, and all you gain is one of your 10 slots back. Often players will feel like it's just not worth the effort to reorganize in that way, but they really hate the poison swamps, and now you can put in a mechanic that doesn't meaningfully change the game's balance for you losing that one slot, but which negates this annoying thing. In that context, I think it's fair to ask, what is the point of having the negating mechanic or the mechanic that it's negating? Why not just remove it? If everybody hates it, and there's a way with minimal drawback to delete it, then why not either delete it or just remove the thing that lets you get rid of it? Because you're effectively, that is how the game is. You're just making the player need to assemble that themselves instead. Is this that compelling of a choice? I think no, personally. Maybe we'll think that it is later, but at the moment, I don't think so. Situation number 2. Same setup. There's an enchantment that negates poison swamps, but the difference this time is that instead of like 10 or whatever build slots, you have 3, let's say. One imagines that in this game, if you have only 3 places to put a build choice, and an entire one of those 3 spaces is taken up by just negating poison swamps, and poison swamps are not Miyazaki Dark Souls level omnipresent in the world. You know, there's actually an okay amount of the game that is poison swamps in some Dark Souls and Elden Ring. So maybe it would still make sense to do that. But assuming that it's assuming it isn't, and the game doesn't have an unholy amount of poison swamps, which it does, you know, but let's just imagine that it didn't. Presumably, it wouldn't really feel worth it to sacrifice a third of your build just to negate this thing that isn't always there. That will often shift the conversation over to players just dealing with it when it comes up, because they can't be bothered to bypass it, or when they're annoyed, then in that specific case, they will equip it as a way to like counterplay that thing. Not only do I think this situation makes the mechanic more of a mechanic, you have poison swamps the players will actually engage with, it also makes the counterplay feel better, in my opinion. After all, in the situation before, you had to sacrifice some of your build system space just to counter the swamp. And if you wanted to not be wasting that space when you're not in a swamp, you'd have to click probably both times when you're in the swamp and when you're not in the swamp to swap between builds, in the best case. But in the example where we make your build space really restricted, but we still include the swamps in the item to counter them, you can still click one time to put the build thing on your build and counter the swamp, but you just don't swap builds every time you go anywhere by default, and it's more likely you'll engage with the swamp initially before then deciding if you just can't be bothered with this and trying to get rid of it. And doesn't it perhaps feel like a good reward to experience the swamp and then equip the thing that kind of negates it a little bit? Could be cool. I think that this model is pretty clearly a best of both worlds in this particular example. Rather than having the build system have a lot of space, both the negative mechanic and the counterplay of the mechanic both get more interesting, and the player has to put less effort in to enjoy them, if you just make the build system's opportunity cost smaller. Obviously, for these all or nothing examples that I kind of started the parlay with, you negate all of poison or whatever, anti-Raigeki, the main question is how much space do you have for it? Sure. And I think a lot of players would respond by saying, well, you want to give me a lot of space, that way I can carry it around. But the question there is, if you always want it equipped, what is the point of there being poison swamps in the game? Poison swamps are either fun or unfun in the game. You can decide that they're unfun. That mechanic is just bad, according to you. Okay, that's a valid answer, sure. But if it is a reasonable mechanic, then you would want it to be restricted, how much space you have to equip the poison swamp thing. Again, people who are thinking, well, I do want more space because I always want to get rid of the poison swamp, I'll ask you, so then don't you want the swamp edited out of the game? That's what you did, so why isn't that what you want? And if you are interested in the challenge of the poison swamp, don't we need to create a situation where you are at some times compelled to not counter the poison swamp? Now, you may just still constantly equip the item for the entire game, and I've definitely played games before I'm not thinking of any examples, but this feeling is very familiar. I'm feeling a vague anxiety slash triumphant feeling of, yeah, I sure told them, where I've played games before where the build system space was restricted, but I never unequipped the counterplay. I had something like, screw your poison swamp, and there was only like 3 build slots in that game, but I just kept it equipped the whole time because I just couldn't be bothered, basically. I sacrificed a whole aspect of the game's build system just because I hated that mechanic that much. One might consider modding at this juncture. Just remove that part of the game. You can do that in the 21st century, like, it's fine. I'm not saying that that's an excuse for the game, but like, if you really hate it that much, but you argue that it shouldn't be like just inherently not a part of the game, I mean, don't you just want to mod it out of the game at some point? I don't know. And so go figure. But the point is, I think that the most sustainable model is lots of build space is kind of bad. I kind of think this is true vaguely in general. If you're making a game and you have any amount of slots for the player to make build system choices, try reducing that by like 50% and rebalance the game accordingly so the enemies don't have way too much health or defenses or do too much damage, given that the player is now less powerful, presumably, and then see what happens. Oftentimes, you basically just made the decisions more interesting. Or if the decisions weren't interesting, this puts pressure on that. Now, you don't have so many spots that you can just equip all the obviously powerful stuff and make the game, you know, okay, you do make some choices, but only because you run out of good effects at all. Whereas if you restrict it, it's either clear that the game's build system is just bad, or it will get better because the decisions were interesting and now there's more pressure placed on them. Then you can let players keep being able to actually make build decisions and have fun with all this stuff by simply allowing them to respec or make different characters, and it all works out. If your game already exists and you haven't done that stuff, maybe that will take extra work, but I think a lot of the time that is a very good ground state of build systems. Many games with build systems that I don't think are working very well, if you did that, they would be working very well. So go figure, development cost of that aside. We have a pretty sustainable model. Obviously, in the, let's say it's not PvP, because that does kind of change it. In a PvE scenario, if the game has a type of poison swamp that ignores your immunity to the normal type of poison swamp, because this is like a super special awesome poison swamp that turbo kills you instead, the Elden Ring, Scarlet Rot. I've never encountered this in a video game before. It's crazy. I can't even imagine that. That would be so ridiculous. Of course, you'd have to really like poison swamps, wouldn't you, Miyazaki? You maybe would feel like, oh, well, now I want to switch to this other thing that makes me immune to this other thing. And it becomes kind of an uphill battle. Again, I don't think that would seem silly, I would argue. It's interesting because, of course, if the player does keep on an immunity to a certain kind of poison swamp, and then they go to a different kind of poison swamp, yes, that might prompt them to remove their immunity to the first type of poison swamp, but you haven't accomplished anything because you only prompted them to change their build to do the same thing with their build. They technically interacted with the build system, but not by changing their mental mechanism for using it. And I think that a lot of developers do the thing I just described, but for a misguided reason. So I want to focus a bit more on that. The point I'm trying to make is that I think a lot of developers know that players resist experimenting with their builds. So they try to do things to the player that cause them to experiment with their build. But then there's a step where they get, I'm going to say pedantic, basically. And they say, anything we can do that will make the player change their build in any way, for any reason, therefore makes them more likely to make more builds in the future. And sure, if a player opens the build screen, and as opposed to they never open the build screen, you might argue that that makes them more likely to make builds in the future and have fun with that part of the game, thus improving the game some amount. But they're making build decisions specifically to avoid making decisions on the build system, specifically as an undecision to remove this thing. In their mind, the reason they're acting with the build system is not to express their personal preference or creativity. It's because the game has put up the prompt where, like matching flags in a game of Simon Says, we're now supposed to equip the anti-Scarlet Rot swamp immunity item, Miyazaki. Okay, I'll stop. You see what I mean? And I don't think that that actually accomplishes the thing that people are thinking it sets out to do. It's not really encouraging the player to make build decisions. They make a decision on the screen where you would make build decisions, but that's not the same thing. That would be like saying that if you put paint to paper, you were instantly teleported to the mental state of an artist. Like, you're not. I would hope we would agree that that's not how it works. You can, in fact, paint a fence without having the brain of Leonardo da Vinci. Like that, it's not a one-to-one process. And so it matters how, maybe obviously when I put it like this, you have the player interact with the build systems. And it could very likely be useless to have the player interact with the build systems if they don't do it in a way that is interesting somehow. This is a real problem, in my opinion, and I don't really want to be too negative about people trying to address it. If game developers are making games with build systems, thinking that it would be good to encourage the player to get some fun out of the build system, and then doing something that they think is for that goal, I don't want to be too harsh and say, no, because you didn't perfectly analyze all of human psychology, which I have, probably not. Therefore, the thing you did is bad. Like, no, I guess it isn't. But at the same time, it's like the least effective version. It's the effective thing you can do that is the worst of all of the things you could do. You are encouraging the player to engage with the build system, but in the worst possible way of ways that do still technically meet the criteria of engaging with the build system, I would argue. On the other hand, a lot of the time when counterplay exists and isn't as direct, people don't know it exists. I've been playing a good amount of Pokemon TCG Pocket, and a really good example has come up in status effects. So in TCG Pocket, and if you played the mainline Pokemon games, like Burn, Poison, Paralyze, Sleep, Freeze, etc. And TCG Pocket has these. They're not a huge part of the game. They're not a gigantic part of normal Pokemon either, I would argue. But they are a thing that exists in the metagame and that you will experience when you play, certainly. In TCG Pocket, there are statuses like Sleep and Paralyze that if they go off and you lose your coin flip on Sleep, your Pokemon is basically stunned for the turn. That's pretty much what they do. There are a couple Pokemon that more or less just by having this Pokemon be in play, your Pokemon cannot have statuses on them, but you can only have 4 Pokemon in play at a time. So if you play, it's called Teal Mask Ogerpon, so I'm going to say Teal Mask, in your deck, and you place it on your bench, your opponent's status cards are more or less shut off. They just don't do anything while that card is out. Your opponent could try to kill your Teal Mask, possibly, and it is worth 2 of the 3 points they need to win, so that is a liability, I guess. But I think it's fair to say that in a lot of strategies, it's not a very big liability. Like that, a lot of the time, it really isn't a liability. I think it's fair to say. There are a few decks, TCG Pocket people, like, I know I'm actually playing something right now that's designed to punish Teal Mask Ogerpon use. But anyway, it's only moderately good because a lot of the time it's a perfectly fine approach and you can just not play it if their opponent's not playing any status counter, or wait to play it until your opponent activates status, which not always works perfectly, but a good amount of the time that will be enough. You don't really need to play it preemptively some of the time. So it's not a very big cost to pay, in some sense, to counter a whole category of effect, right? And the decks that benefit from the status usually benefit pretty highly. There's a pretty centralizing strategy at the moment in TCG Pocket where you shut down a lot of their game plan completely, and those cards do next to nothing, very close to nothing. / they kind of just lose. It can be really bad if you play this card. Playing one of it and getting it consistently can be a little hairy, but the point stands. The thing about the card is that it's like not bad as a normal, like you can use Teal Mask to win and defeat your opponent's Pokemon as well. It's not like great, nor is it terrible. It's a reasonable card on the surface. If it was a normal card you were not playing to counter status, you probably wouldn't play it, but neither is it very bad. And I think this is a common approach. Make the counterplay be a mediocre generalist option that still does something, but is just like whatever as a game piece. But you can still use it. But then against a certain type of weapon or strategy, it's a hard counter. Another example would be like in a shooter. Sometimes a weapon is a mediocre, it's a whatever gun normally, but it really badly hard counters a certain other type of strategy. An example I would give is back when people were using the smart pistol in Titanfall, you could use something like the Cold War. This is a charge burst grenade launcher. You hold down the button and it goes and then shoots a little volley of grenades. The smart pistol would lock on enough to kill you slower than the grenades would charge up. So as long as you pointed the grenade launcher at them and fired, you would almost exactly beat them every time. At least that was my experience. Maybe I had a knack for the Cold War grenade launcher, but go figure. I do like that weapon. And the smart pistol player would lose because their gun inherently requires them to take a pause when they shoot. Overall, with weapons that can start shooting you immediately, I think the Cold War is a normal, it's a fair weapon. It is like, it's fine. You can kill people with it, but a lot of the time, since they start shooting you first, and if you miss a grenade or whatever and they survive, then they will kill you just after your Cold War finishes firing. It's a relatively normal or fair weapon besides the counterblade of the smart pistol, with its own disadvantages. You know, it's a lobbed grenade launcher. It doesn't have amazing range or accuracy at range. You know, normal drawback weapon stuff. My point is, if you imagine the smart pistol didn't exist, it's a maybe C tier option. I don't know, it doesn't really matter, but just in this example. But then it's kind of like C tier asterisk also shits all over the smart pistol, you know, and rightly so, you know, fair enough. So that kind of option, I personally think, is a lot better because it allows the player to, first of all, the player can just like that thing. They get to pick up counterplay with a game piece that is still fun or usable. You can still play the game with that thing while using it. And third, the player also, this is important, doesn't need to know that it counterplays the other thing. Some players will just be using this weapon and be having success, find that they're having success against people using this other weapon. And a lot of them don't know that that weapon is kind of specifically set up in a way that it will counterplay this other weapon. Again, Titanfall people, I'm just making up an example. That was my experience. It doesn't matter if it actually does that. You get the concept. And this is good because I think that a lot of the reason that counterplay doesn't work well and a lot of people's positive reactions to the highly specific counterplay stuff is because they don't find other counterplay that does exist. So in my Pokemon example, you can also cleanse statuses by switching out your Pokemon. Not all statuses allow you to do that. You can also cleanse statuses by evolving a Pokemon. A lot of people, I think, forget that that is the case. If you play a basic that evolves twice, Bulbasaur evolves into Ivysaur, which evolves into Venusaur, or whatever, Charmander, Charmeleon, Charizard. If you play Charmander and then get statused, but you evolve it to Charmeleon, you cleanse the status in that moment. Only once, but then they status you again, and you play Charizard, and you cleanse the status again. This is a pretty effective stopgap to status strategies, but I think a lot of people have kind of overlooked it a little. Another thing is that even though the stun statuses, like Paralyze and Sleep, don't let you swap out, you can be swapped out manually. There's a couple of cards that in TCG Pocket that help you switch out and switch in. Usually the big thing about these is they bypass the Pokemon's retreat cost. You don't need to know what that means, but that's why you'd want to do that. They let you switch out, but without using something on the Pokemon you are switching out. Therefore, that Pokemon can be stunned, and you can still switch them out, which unstuns them. And so if you play a strategy, hypothetically, where you have two Pokemon that do this, you can just swap your Pokemon out and then swap it back in. That's a status counter just fine. And you probably already wanted to be using those cards, is the point. Even though the status meta in TCG Pocket has been so complained about and so toxic, I agree, it's very bad. And I'm kind of horrified that they've done this to a game I felt like was in a really good place before, a really good place. And now it's a toxic wasteland. It's bad, yes. But I have seen, I think, literally nobody other than me. I'm sure there are people. I bet at the higher levels of the ladder that I'm just not at. But I am at low Master Ball. I mean, that's not super high. But like, I bet only very advanced players are doing this for some reason. I haven't really seen people playing the other counterplay to statuses that, doesn't interfere with your deck. You know what I mean? People will say, oh, well, you have to play the status counter. And people go, but then it's useless in the rest of the matchups. If only there was a way to counter status that isn't useless in the other matchups. Stares at a giant pile of those things. So I'm not trying to be coy or callous or whatever. My point is, a lot of the time, I think more than you would expect. In Magic the Gathering is another example where I have a lot of PvP experience. Counterplay does exist, but just isn't used. And so making it more clear has some access implications rather than just being like, oh, but that makes it less interesting, you know. There are a lot of games like, for me, it was Magic the Gathering, that have this other approach that I was mentioning where the very specific counterplay is a usable game piece by itself. It's a relatively aggressive creature that you can beat your opponent down with. It also counters counter spells or something in blue. Magic cards like that exist a lot of the time. They're on a body or whatever. And this is good in two ways. It adds counterplay to the counterplay. You can kill it with a normal creature kill spell, and you will remove your opponent's effect that is preventing your counter spells from working. But it also means that the card is not useless when you're not in a matchup where it's relevant, or you are in a matchup where it's relevant, but your opponent doesn't draw very many counter spells or whatever. These are really good, in my opinion. It's a great way to make the game still playable, and you don't just sacrifice part of the game's fun, part of your build system, wholly for something that does literally nothing except, counter a very specific thing. So I think that's a very good solution, and I think a lot of games maybe don't always see it that way. Like if there was a weapon that let you turn off your opponent's perks, then John Megadeth having a death ray and you countering the death ray with your perk that counters death rays, but then another player has the ability to shoot you with an ability that turns off perks, and then John Megadeth's death ray, it doesn't get countered because your perk is turned off, then what's to stop John Megadeth from equipping the weapon that counters perks, shooting you with it, and then swapping and shooting you with his death ray? Well, the game could be designed, if that was the model of counterplay they were interested in, to only allow you to carry one weapon, or to make there be very valuable generalist secondary weapons, like a mine layer secondary that allows you to pump mines into the ground and create a barrier such that you can control a point or create a sniper nest for yourself. But you have to pick that or the weapon that turns off other players' perks. Therefore, if you're going to snipe with your death ray and you have one secondary option, you can pick the thing that turns off their immunity to death rays or their resistance to death rays. But you have to sacrifice having your area defense at the same time. This is a way where by adding another game piece, but which is not counterplay to the counterplay, you can make the situation better the same way as adding counterplay to the counterplay, but in a way that is fun gameplay instead of some ultra specific whatever. And I think you would find that a lot of players would just use the mine layer option, and therefore it does beg the question, what is the point of the weapon that shoots off the perk that counters the death ray? Why not just remove the counterplay to the counterplay? You cannot remove the counterplay to the counterplay, but make it more interesting by adding other game options. So if that works, why not also just remove the counterplay to the counterplay and then make the counterplay itself a little bit less strict? Could be cool. I don't know. For example, I think that a death ray resistance perk like this, it might be better than making it give you partial resistance, you can still die to it, or total resistance, you're literally immune to it, to instead have it do something like, if you're above 90% health, you will not be one-shotted by death rays. But otherwise, it just doesn't do anything. You could still get two-shotted. I don't know, I'm assuming it's like a sniper laser. But you just prevent one-shots, basically. Or in a lot of games, this is the threshold of damage reduction. In Apex Legends, for a little while, there was this situation where the Kraber, a really rare airdrop sniper rifle, would one-shot headshot anybody unless you had the best helmet, which was another rare piece of loot. And so that helmet usually didn't do much. Against most other weapons, you're still going to die in multiple hits, and it may not change the number of hits from the second best helmet. But against the Kraber specifically, it meant that the one weapon that would just totally one-tap you now just barely does not one-tap you. I guess it's kind of the same thing. But you get the idea. I feel like that type of resistance or counterplay is kind of better, where it's still just a better helmet, but it's better in a specific way where it makes you hit a threshold of survivability that makes this weapon like meaningfully worse in practice, even though on paper you're still reducing its damage by the same amount as everything else. Okay, and it's conversations like this. Let's just pause for a moment. Yeah, we were taking some shots before. We're also assuming the developers know what balance is, which isn't always the case. Yeah, I see your snark and call the bet that you've placed on developers maybe not totally understanding that. I will match that bet. Yes, I do think a lot of developers like don't have their heads on straight about balance, or don't know what balance is like for, basically, I guess is what I think is really the problem. It's for fun. It's to create fun. Balancing something by making something weaker when it is too strong makes the game more fun. It only appears not to make the game more fun to bellyachers who want to have power over other people instead of have a fair, fun match. Those people actually don't have the exclusive rights to the definition of fun, it turns out. Some guy camping you in Call of Duty is not, it turns out, the executive manager of the term fun. And so they can have slightly less fun from their misguided definition of fun, and that's fine. It doesn't matter. That's the magical thing about these words. I actually don't agree that that's fun, and so we could optimize for this other thing that I think is fun. And what you would see is that maybe more people would find that fun if they're not getting camped all the time, and then the game will be improved. And just because Johnny Camps a lot is upset doesn't mean that that balance didn't make the game more fun. It did for most people. That being said, I think after this conversation, we should be fair and say, this is kind of complicated. It's kind of complicated. Like, the effects do require some sitting down and figuring it out. As I have probably complained in similar Parley before, the main thing I am not okay with developers is the point of the conversation where sitting down to do this for 1/2 hour somehow wasn't a thing that happened when they spent years making a video game. Like, I'm sure you can do it. You're smart people. And I have absolutely no doubt that when developers do sit down to do this, they successfully do it. Like that, I guess that's where the games that have decent balance in them have come from, right? What I'm assuming is not that they're like stupid and I'm a genius and that's why I know what balance is, but simply that for whatever reason, most developers must not be sitting down to do this at all, even once. But like, why not? That's the centralizing question here. And on a broader level, if you don't want to ask these kinds of questions, do you want to be a game developer? Do you want to be a game developer? Not just the person who likes games or even makes games, but a person who is an entertainer who produces games for other people. Is this not the job to think this thing? Does it take an impractical amount of development time or development resources? No, it doesn't, actually. And so is there really a reason not to be doing this for most games? No, I would argue, sure. That being said, I don't want to act like it's trivial, like it really is the most obvious thing in the world. You would need to sit down and discuss it. And I know a lot of people currently think that many problems in game design are because the developer is overly pursuing balance. In many cases, I believe what is happening, yes, that does appear to be the case, is that the developer is doing lazier balance. They just nerf things into the ground to make sure that problem is gone, so the community isn't repeatedly complaining about this one thing, which doesn't work, by the way. They always just move on to the next thing. You have to systematically balance things using some method, some consistent criteria for that to be anything but just whack-a-mole. The next broken thing will pop up. And communities actually often argue against the act of balancing entirely for that very reason. They say, well, but if they nerf this thing, what's the point? Because the next overpowered thing will just appear. This appears like a sensible thing to say. That does seem to be what happens when most games are balanced, but that's because they're being balanced poorly, not because it's impossible to balance a game in a way where a stable orbit is achieved. That just doesn't happen often enough for people to realistically have faith that it will. But that's not the same as it not being possible. People are making the understandable but misguided cognitive leap that because you usually don't see games achieve stable balance, therefore inherently balance means bad balance. But No, it doesn't. You could just balance things effectively using a good system, and then it would be balanced. I always feel somewhat crazy when we have these conversations, but I love this kind of parlay. I think that's useful, and I don't want to be snarky. I'm being snarky. I'm not trying to be an asshole to people who are confused about this. It's confusing. I'm confused about it too. I'm just trying to bring into relief that there is a mistaken use of terms here. I'm not trying to be pedantic about the word. Just that people have taken a jump too far and assume that because we usually see balance be a game of whack-a-mole, therefore balance is just pointless, rather than the other, I would hope, readily available assumption, which is maybe that balance just wasn't very good. And the sympathy I have, I guess, is that most players complaining about these whack-a-mole balance decisions but do think the balance decision was bad. So my problem is just that they don't then conclude that it was a bad balance decision, rather than saying balance decisions are bad. You see what I mean? Why wasn't that just a bad one? But it's a good idea. That just wasn't a good version of that idea. And the reason for that is that a lot of players have not gotten to the point where they see the benefit of not just having the same old reliable thing work forever. And how about this? I'm not actually sure there is a good reason not to have the same old reliable thing work forever. A good way to get players to use something new is to make there be another thing that is cool, not force them to kick them out of their house of comfort in the game and then make them go find something else. I recall an example when I was playing Warframe in arbitrations. Arbitrations are like a challenge mode. There are arbitrary challenges that exist in Warframe, and in arbitrations there are these drones that aid the enemies in combat to require a bit more precision to kill. The drones are resistant or immune, or I forget, to some explosives. So if there's a whole group of enemies and there's a drone, the drone makes the group immune to all damage until you kill the drone, which is like small. It's like a floating head. It's a floating headshot. So what you're meant to do is aim up very precisely, surgically, badass, shoot the drone defending the whole group, and then mow them down with whatever method you wish, possibly switch to an AoE weapon. While the drones themselves are meant to be immune to those things so that they present the challenge that's there. Like we talked about earlier in the conversation, this is the point at which a lot of people bug out because they're not willing to ask whether they just don't like that part of the game. The purpose of the drone is to give you the experience of aim and precision mattering when you do that content. You don't have to agree that that is fun, but if you don't, it's not good to bypass the drones. You just don't like that piece of content, or maybe even that game. Trying to bypass the drone is like, well, why is it even, they should just take them out. Like, going a step further, it either is fun to people and therefore they should leave them in and make it so you can't cheese past them, or they should remove them. Whereas a lot of players seem to just kind of sit in this spot where they go, they're bad and nobody likes them, yet at the same time, I want to keep playing this mode and I want to bypass them. And it's like, well, why don't you just have them be taken out? Or what do you think about the fun they're supposed to provide? I'm sure some people do suggest just deleting them. But like, if you then turn around and complain that the rest of the game is boring, that's a you problem at that point. And the players can be wrong. Like, folks, say it louder for the people in the back. The player may not have thought about, like, well, what is the point of the game otherwise? Or if I'm concerned because the game is too easy, but then I complain when challenge is added, I don't have a sustainable desire for the game, which is my fault. That's not really the game's fault. I just don't want a game that has answers to those questions. On the game's end, you have situations where often seeing this situation, they think that if they just nerf all the counterplay to the thing, you can force the player to engage. But that doesn't work because, as we established before, the player's behavior already kind of indicates that they basically just don't want the thing in the game, or they don't see why it would be fun. If you don't address that point, then you nerfing the thing they're using to bypass it isn't going to do anything productive. They're going to look for something else to bypass it, which they'll almost certainly find if the game is big, and or just not play the game anymore. Instead, it would have been more effective to provide more counterplay rather than less, but make it all weaker. Not non-functional, but weaker. Make all AoE weapons work on the drones, but make them weaker. And then players can consider using them or using a more efficient weapon. That could be an option. Or make sure to nerf the thing very carefully and say you're going to do rounds of gradual damage reduction for that weapon because you want it to be powerful. You want it to be as good as it could be without it making the game pointless, basically. I was very frustrated when Warframe, having this problem, brought up a stream where they said, we're going to explain why we're changing this thing. And I thought, yes, they're realizing that this is a futile exercise and you need to talk about this subject. And they didn't explain that reasoning. If they thought it, they didn't say that. They instead showed statistics showing how overwhelmingly this one weapon was being used. This is beside the point of the discussion. That's not a reason to have people stop using it. Evidently, they either like using it or they negatively feel like they need to use something that would counter this mechanic. That means they want something in there. You are not addressing the thing that they want by just removing that one weapon. That doesn't add to the happiness. Again, as a person who knows people just ignore using build systems, I know where you're coming from, but this isn't a functional way to do it. It doesn't work. You need to address the core idea. You have to really ask what the point of these systems is. And on a broader level, if you want to make a good game and not run into these problems, all you have to do is constantly ask, what is the point of putting this into the game? And the real source of all of this trouble is that most existing games don't ask that question until they're already made, and therefore they're a live service or they're getting DLC, and only then, once the game is complete, do they then ask, what is the point of the game being this way? And there are some interesting positive results to that we could talk about some other time, such as the many games where the game is completely feature complete and released, but then just quietly off screen, the developer releases a co-op update where the game is not changed at all, but you can just accept that. You can use local co-op or whatever, or through Steam, like Play Together. Steam Play Together is a great feature sometimes to play the game co-op, and that's it. You know, not to undersell the amount of work that can take, by the way, but like they don't change the game systems in any way. They literally just add the ability to be multiplayer. And that change alone often wakes the whole game back up and is really good and a lot of fun. There are tons of games I can think of that a huge amount of the entertainment value in that game was an afterthought, that when you look at the game, it's like, wait, why would you think this wouldn't be really good co-op? That's odd. Like, I feel like that would have been a way better marketing point for the game. And yet it was the thing they thought of last. Why? They're not idiots. They didn't think of it in terms of what the purpose of the design things are until it was finished. And then they did, and they're very smart, so when they did that, it worked, and they added something awesome to the game. I think all too often that's what it is. In a game system where the game isn't designed around the things being in the game for specific purposes, if you try to then change it so that things are designed for specific purposes, just making one good balance change would require refactoring like half of the game to obey that logic, or it wouldn't really work, and then the developer is stuck. So I guess the advice here is don't develop a game without thinking about the underlying reasoning behind things that way. Which is kind of unusable to many existing games. Maybe the real advice, the real advice, the real problem, how's that for enough? That's the number I counted. Hey, shut up. Is that the players don't have time to carefully choose games because of their systems. If you see a trailer for a game, you didn't see any gameplay or you don't know anything about the game, the part you operate, the things you have to do, ignore it. It doesn't matter. You don't know anything about that game. You don't know the things that matter when you were to play the game. The game's aesthetic is not what you're going to have to do when you play it. The game's visuals are not its balance. And these are the things that will hold all of your entertainment hostage, whether you know it or not, and you will know it the more you think about this, unless they are designed in a coherent way. And the problem, I guess, the real problem, I still counted, that was 6. Go ahead, check. Is that the industry doesn't have a way to word this right now. You can't really look up a game and see, by looking up the game, does this have like an attempt at this concept? But I have a way to word that, which is that the game has coherent build systems. The game has solid build system ideas, because that's the one thing that you can only represent by explaining like how it works, which is the thing that matters, according to me. good parlay. That's my analysis. If you'd like your own parlay like this one, you can get one using a link in the description. I know some of you folks just support the show there, so thank you very much. Looking forward to the next one.